We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
The orchestra was still playing when Catherine rose from the most important table in the room. She did not argue. She did not demand an explanation. She simply looked toward the center seat that had been prepared for her, saw Meghan settling into it beneath the gaze of the entire banquet hall, and walked out. Within seconds, a glittering state occasion became the scene of a royal rupture no one could disguise. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine stopped behind the chair, resting 2 fingers against its carved back as the room tightened around her. Meghan looked up, but did not rise. William turned toward his wife, panic crossing his face, yet no command came. Then the Princess of Wales spoke quietly enough to force everyone nearby to listen. "I will not compete for a place that is already mine." She released the chair and walked away without another word. The banquet was a state occasion, a formal dinner hosted by the sovereign to honor foreign leaders and represent national unity. Senior royals, diplomats, ministers, and chosen guests filled the hall, making every seat part of a public message. Catherine's place beside William was not casual. As the future king's wife, her central position signaled rank, succession, and the authority she would one day carry beside him. Meghan had entered moments earlier and taken that assigned seat with confidence. She remained there as Catherine approached, reading silence as hesitation rather than warning. Moving under hundreds of watching eyes would have felt like public defeat. For Catherine, allowing the moment to pass would have turned years of duty into something anyone could challenge. William understood both dangers. Ordering Meghan away could ignite a spectacle before foreign dignitaries. Doing nothing meant allowing his wife to be humiliated in the place meant to affirm her standing. His hesitation lasted seconds, but those seconds were enough. Charles looked down as a folded napkin shifted beside Meghan's plate. Beneath it lay a place card bearing Catherine's name. The king reached for it, then stopped, his expression hardening. This was no innocent confusion. Someone inside the palace had moved the card and allowed Meghan to believe the center position was hers. Anne rose before anyone could explain. The Princess Royal did not follow Catherine. Instead, she turned toward the official guarding the final seating plan and demanded the authorization sheet. But before the palace could determine who had moved the name card, it first had to face the deeper truth, that every person at that table had arrived carrying a different fear. To the guests watching from across the hall, it appeared to be a dispute over a chair. To Catherine, Meghan, and Queen Camilla, it represented something far more dangerous. One woman believed she had earned the right to stand at the center of the monarchy's future. Another believed that future had once been denied to her. And the third understood that when royal women fight over position, the men around them often discover how little control they truly possess. Catherine had spent years preparing for a future she could never treat casually. Every appearance and carefully chosen word had trained her to carry responsibility without complaint. As the future queen, meaning the woman expected to stand beside the next monarch, her place at a state banquet was not decoration, it was a public sign of continuity. Yielding that position would feel like surrendering the value of every sacrifice she had made. Meghan carried a different wound into the palace. She had returned knowing every glance would measure whether she still mattered. A distant seat would confirm her deepest fear, that the institution still saw her as peripheral and powerless. She told herself that accepting less would look like defeat, and pride hardened into resolve. Catherine sensed the danger before dinner. In a private preparation room, she fastened the bracelet Queen Elizabeth had given her, and froze when an aide said Meghan had requested a more central placement. The Princess of Wales asked whether the request had been approved. The aide hesitated. That pause told her enough. William waited near the banquet entrance, adjusting his cufflinks repeatedly, as though precision could settle the conflict gathering around him. Catherine expected him to defend the order of succession. Meghan expected him to prove she had not returned merely to be diminished. The prince understood both expectations, and that knowledge slowed him when speed mattered most. Camilla felt the trap forming. In a private exchange later preserved in a documented household account, she warned Charles that the dispute was not spontaneous. Someone had encouraged Meghan to test how much authority Catherine truly held. The Queen Consort feared the evening had been arranged to force a reaction, and the king heard that fear beneath her controlled voice. Anne soon found proof. The Princess Royal learned from a signed briefing note that Meghan had been shown a revised seating diagram 20 minutes before dinner, even though no authorized change existed. Catherine's departure looked sudden only to those who did not know what she had promised herself months earlier. The banquet walkout shocked the palace, yet the true point of no return had occurred months earlier, during a ceremony where a whispered sentence changed Catherine's patience into resolve. Long before Catherine abandoned the banquet, she had been confronted with a quieter insult. One almost invisible to the public, but impossible for her to forget. It happened during a Commonwealth reception, beneath polite applause and carefully arranged smiles. Meghan leaned close, while photographers turned away, and delivered a sentence intended for Catherine alone. No argument followed. No scene erupted. Yet from that moment, the Princess of Wales began preparing for the day she would finally refuse to remain silent. Catherine had entered the Commonwealth Legacy reception, determined to keep the peace. The event at St. James's Palace brought together representatives from nations linked through the Commonwealth, a voluntary association built around shared history and cooperation. Every greeting position mattered because it signaled who carried authority and who stood closest to the monarchy's future. Meghan's return had already made the room tense, and even a small change could become a public judgment. Meghan stepped into Catherine's place in the formal greeting line just before the first guests approached. She smiled, leaned closer, and whispered, "People look at whoever stands in the center, not whoever was promised it." The words were quiet, but their meaning was brutal. Years of discipline, criticism, and duty had been reduced to a struggle for attention. Catherine did not react. She continued shaking hands, speaking warmly, and protecting the ceremony from scandal. Later, she entered an empty side chamber, removed one glove finger by finger, and asked her aide to create a documented account of the exact sentence. Her control remained intact, but something inside her had shifted. She feared that answering publicly would make her look insecure, yet silence now felt like permission. William urged patience that evening during a private conversation at home. The prince argued that confrontation would only deepen the conflict and place Charles under greater pressure. Catherine listened, but his appeal wounded her. Once again, preserving royal calm required her to absorb the insult alone. Anne later broke her silence through a recorded conversation with the king's private secretary. The Princess Royal revealed that Meghan's position in the greeting line had been changed without authorization. A junior courtier then admitted, in a signed statement, that an unnamed senior household official claimed William wanted Meghan placed more prominently. Catherine confronted him after reading the account. She told the future king that if the same challenge happened again before the public, she would not argue, plead, or compete. She would leave. At the state banquet, she kept that promise. Now the warning had become reality, and when William finally reached Catherine behind the closed banquet doors, patience was no longer the language she was willing to speak. William found Catherine in the private corridor beyond the banquet chamber, standing beneath a portrait of a queen who had survived decades of palace conflict without surrendering her composure. Catherine was calm, but it was not the calm of forgiveness. It was the stillness of someone who had reached the end of a promise. When William asked her to return, she turned toward him and forced the future king to confront what his silence had cost. William had followed her, while Charles and Anne remained inside, struggling to keep the banquet from collapsing into open disorder. The prince had always believed royal crises should be contained before the public could see them. Containment meant keeping conflict behind closed doors, protecting official events, and preventing family wounds from becoming national spectacle. Catherine had once accepted that duty. Now she saw how often it had become an excuse for avoiding painful choices. William asked her to return for only 10 minutes. No aides stood between them. No courtier could soften the words. Catherine looked directly at him and said, "10 minutes beside that chair would tell everyone that what happened was acceptable." William reached for her hand, but she stepped back. Catherine removed the bracelet she had fastened before the banquet and placed it on a console table with deliberate care. The gesture carried the weight of a formal ending. She was not abandoning her marriage, but she was ending her participation in the performance of harmony. William admitted that he had frozen. Ordering Meghan to move before foreign guests might have triggered another confrontation with Harry, overshadowed the state visit, and turned a diplomatic evening into a Sussex scandal. Catherine heard the explanation without interrupting. Then she told him the truth he had been avoiding. His fear of another crisis had made her dignity negotiable. The prince lowered his voice and revealed, through a recorded private conversation, later preserved in the household account, that he had never approved any seating change. An official had told him Catherine herself requested Meghan sit beside him as a gesture of reconciliation. Catherine recognized the wording immediately. It echoed the same false claim used at the Commonwealth reception, when someone had also invoked William's wishes to place Meghan more prominently. This was not confusion. Someone had been using his name to engineer repeated confrontations and force her into silence. Anne entered before either could speak again. The Princess Royal held the original seating authorization in one hand, and her expression told them the signature at the bottom reached directly into the king's household. The crisis was no longer between Catherine and Meghan, because the paper in Anne's hand showed that a far more powerful figure had quietly placed both women on a collision course. The banquet hall believed Catherine had walked out because Meghan took her seat. Inside the king's private study, the royal family discovered something more disturbing. The confrontation had been prepared in advance. The altered seating chart carried an official authorization code, a handwritten approval, and a timing designed to make correction almost impossible. Yet the person who signed it did not appear frightened when Charles summoned them. They appeared convinced the king would understand. Charles sat behind his desk, holding both versions of the seating plan, and the sadness in his face was harder to hide than anger. A state banquet protocol office is the palace team that arranges formal positions for major royal events. But any last-minute change involving senior family members requires approval from the highest household level. That mattered because ceremonial placement tells the public who stands closest to power. Moving one name could alter the meaning of the entire room. The king placed the original document beside the altered one and asked his deputy private secretary why Catherine's name card had been removed after the tables were inspected. The official hesitated before answering through a documented account later preserved in the palace file. Camilla had verbally supported giving Meghan a more central position, so she would not feel publicly excluded. Charles looked down at the papers again. Defending his wife meant risking Catherine's humiliation. Defending Catherine meant exposing that the queen consort had interfered in an arrangement tied directly to royal rank. The monarch understood that either choice would deepen the wound. Camilla entered without waiting to be invited. She insisted she had tried to prevent a scene, not create one. The queen believed that placing Meghan near William would signal reconciliation and stop the evening from becoming another public rejection. Then she saw the hidden name card and realized her intervention had done the opposite. Her attempt at compassion had become a weapon. Anne set a printed message on the desk. The Princess Royal had obtained it from the banquet briefing record, and it stated that the center seat reflected the king and queen's personal wish. Meghan had therefore arrived believing senior royal authority protected her position. Catherine had been left completely uninformed. Charles finally saw the full design. One woman had been encouraged to sit. Another had been forced to discover the change in front of the room. The conflict had not merely been allowed, it had been engineered through silence, assumption, and misplaced influence. The king had seconds to decide whether to expose Camilla's intervention or preserve palace unity. Then a message arrived from the banquet hall. Before the king could contain the truth, Meghan made a decision at the table that transformed a private manipulation into a public and irreversible fracture. For several minutes after Catherine's departure, the banquet continued in a performance of normality so strained that every guest could feel it breaking. William's chair remained empty. Anne no longer touched her meal. Charles stared toward the doors through which his son and daughter-in-law had vanished. At the center of it all sat Meghan, surrounded by gold, music, and silence, slowly realizing that the seat she had claimed had become the loneliest place in the palace. Officials moved carefully along the edges of the room, telling the orchestra to continue and instructing the serving staff not to react. A state banquet is a formal dinner held by the sovereign for foreign leaders, with every entrance, toast, and seating position planned in advance. Leaving one early is almost unheard of, because every absence is immediately noticed. Catherine's empty place and William's disappearance had therefore become impossible to hide. Meghan received a folded note from a senior aide, asking her to move to the seat originally assigned to her. She read it once, then again. Her jaw tightened. Instead of rising, she placed the message beneath her glass and remained still, as though movement would confirm guilt. Anne watched the gesture and stood. The Princess Royal crossed the room, placed Catherine's recovered name card beside Meghan's plate, and said quietly, "This is not the place you were given." The words were controlled, but the anger behind them was unmistakable. Meghan answered that she had followed instructions sent in the king's name. She refused to accept blame for a decision made inside the palace, especially with foreign guests watching. The Duchess felt cornered, exposed, and suddenly abandoned by the same authority that had encouraged her confidence. Anne understood part of that truth. A documented household account later recorded that the Queen Consort's office had sent the seating message directly to Meghan. Harry confirmed it in a private recorded conversation with Charles, insisting his wife had not invented the arrangement. Yet the Princess Royal also saw something harder. Meghan had turned every concession into a test of status, and now she was refusing to surrender, even after the deception became clear. Charles made the final decision. The king ordered the center chair removed entirely, rather than allowing anyone else to occupy it. Servants lifted it before the silent room, and the message was brutal. The position had become too damaged to remain. Catherine was already preparing to leave the palace when William reached her again. This time, he did not ask her to return. He came carrying a confession. The removal of the chair ended the banquet dispute, but only William's next confession could determine whether Catherine's departure would become a temporary protest or a permanent emotional divide. Catherine had already reached the private exit when William caught up with her for the second time. There were no cameras, no advisors, and no banquet guests waiting for royal composure. Only a husband, a wife, and the damage created by years of choosing silence over confrontation. William did not ask her to return again. Instead, he admitted that the seat beside him had never been the true issue. The issue was whether Catherine could still trust him to defend it. Catherine stood with one hand near the door, fighting the urge to leave, before anger became something harsher. Buckingham Palace had hosted the banquet as a symbol of national unity. Yet inside its walls, she had felt abandoned by the man expected to stand beside her through every public test. Distance seemed safer than saying words she might never be able to take back. William understood that restoring ceremonial order would solve nothing. A state banquet sash, the formal band worn across royal dress to represent rank and honor, still crossed his chest. He removed it slowly and placed it over the back of a nearby chair. The gesture stripped away the performance of duty and left only the truth between them. The prince admitted that he had seen Meghan in Catherine's seat before she entered. He had noticed the name card was missing. Still, he waited, hoping an official would correct the mistake without forcing him to act. Then he said the words Catherine had needed to hear. "I chose the room over you for 30 seconds, and that was long enough." Catherine did not soften immediately. She told him that Meghan's decision had wounded her, but his hesitation had cut deeper. The Duchess could challenge a chair. Only William could make her feel alone before the entire royal establishment. His silence had turned a public insult into a private betrayal. William accepted the accusation without hiding behind protocol, Harry, or the fear of another scandal. In a recorded conversation later included in the household investigation, he acknowledged that the same weakness had shaped his response after the Commonwealth reception. This time, the future king did not ask Catherine for patience. He offered responsibility. The prince then revealed that Charles had ordered a written investigation into the altered seating plan and intended to confront the manipulation before the banquet ended. The king would no longer allow silence to protect the person responsible. Catherine agreed to stay, but not to return to the dining hall. She walked beside William toward the private family chamber, choosing honest reconciliation over ceremonial obedience. Their united departure from the public rooms sent a message no announcement could contain. Catherine did not reclaim the center seat that night, yet the image that emerged outside the banquet would show the world that she had reclaimed something far more important. By sunrise, the banquet itself had become secondary. Britain was focused on one image, Catherine and William leaving through a private palace entrance together, his ceremonial sash removed, her expression composed but unsmiling. Behind them, through the distant banquet windows, guests were still seated beneath chandeliers. The photograph captured two realities in a single frame: the monarchy, performing stability inside, and its future leadership, confronting a painful truth beyond the reach of protocol. Newsrooms rebuilt the night piece by piece. Arrival footage showed Meghan entering with confidence. Guest accounts confirmed that Catherine stopped behind the disputed chair. Seating diagrams then exposed the gap between what had been officially approved and what guests saw inside the hall. The palace finally released a statement confirming an unauthorized seating alteration and acknowledging that the Prince and Princess of Wales had left the banquet early. The Crown Chronicle seized the moment. Its morning front page showed the empty center chair beneath the headline, "The seat she refused to fight for." The image turned a private wound into a national symbol. Royal seating was no longer being discussed as simple ceremony. It had become a question of dignity, authority, and whether silence still protected the wrong people. Catherine read the headline at Kensington Palace and felt no victory. She folded the newspaper before her children entered, unwilling to let them see how deeply the night had affected her. The princess understood that public sympathy could not erase the moment William hesitated, or the years of pressure behind her decision to leave. Meghan watched broadcasters describe her as the sole aggressor and felt scapegoated. Harry defended her through a recorded television statement, insisting she had followed instructions issued by palace officials. The Duke argued that his wife had entered the room believing the arrangement carried royal approval, and his anger shifted attention toward the household that sent the message. Camilla sat through a televised replay of the chair being removed. The Queen Consort finally understood that her attempt to spare Meghan embarrassment had damaged Catherine instead. A broadcaster then displayed both seating plans side by side, highlighting the handwritten authorization from her office and ending any claim that the future queen had misunderstood the arrangement. Crowds gathered quietly outside Kensington Palace, carrying white flowers and handwritten cards. One message appeared again and again: dignity does not need a chair. Catherine's walkout had become an act of restraint rather than defeat. Charles could no longer delay judgment. The king summoned Catherine, Meghan, William, and Camilla for a final family meeting. Public opinion had already delivered its judgment, but only the family's final meeting could determine whether the night ended in punishment, reconciliation, or permanent separation. The final meeting did not begin with raised voices. It began with the disputed place card lying at the center of a plain wooden table, stripped of the gold, music, and ceremony that had made it powerful. Catherine sat opposite Meghan. William remained beside his wife. Charles faced Camilla, with the altered seating chart between them. Every person in the room now understood the same truth. The banquet crisis had not been caused by one chair, but by years of silence, resentment, and misplaced intervention. Charles opened the meeting with a conclusion no one could challenge. Camilla's office had authorized the seating change without Catherine's knowledge and had wrongly presented it as the king's personal approval. The monarch then declared that future state event seating would be controlled only by the official protocol office, the palace department responsible for arranging rank, order, and formal positions. No private household would ever again be allowed to interfere. Camilla looked directly at Catherine. The Queen Consort admitted she had wanted to prevent Meghan from feeling excluded. But she had failed to consider what that decision would do to the woman whose place was being taken. Her attempt to protect one person had publicly displaced another. Catherine accepted the apology without pretending that forgiveness erased the damage. She told the room that compassion could never demand humiliation as its price. Protecting Meghan's feelings had not required sacrificing her dignity, and silence had allowed the insult to grow. Meghan then admitted through the recorded family account that she had seen Catherine's name card beneath the napkin after sitting down. She remained because standing up before the guests would have felt like surrender. The Duchess expected understanding. Instead, Catherine answered with painful calm. "Dignity is not surrender," she said. "The moment you knew the seat belonged to someone else, it stopped being a palace mistake and became your decision." Meghan apologized for refusing to move. Camilla surrendered her informal influence over ceremonial arrangements, while William promised that any future challenge to his wife's role would receive an immediate answer. The prince no longer defended hesitation. He understood what it had nearly cost him. Charles picked up the altered seating chart and tore it in half. The king then placed the original name card before Catherine and told her she should never again be forced to prove a position already secured through duty. Catherine's walkout was no longer remembered as jealousy, weakness, or defeat. It became the moment she rejected a palace culture that expected women to endure humiliation for the sake of appearances. Meghan left with clear boundaries. Camilla left with reduced influence. William left with his loyalty settled beyond doubt. The banquet began with Meghan occupying Catherine's seat, but it ended with the monarchy recognizing that Catherine's true place had never depended on a chair, and could no longer be questioned by anyone inside the palace. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.